Whether you like it or not, most of our reality these days is completely digital. We waste our time and rot our brains scrolling endlessly on social media, bouncing between cat videos and OnlyFans in a desperate attempt to feed our increasingly blown out dopamine receptors. But what if I told you there was once a world, a medieval world, overflowing with mystery, wonder, and imagination, where reality was something you created instead of something spoon-fed to you by a soulless tech company? In this video, we're going to uncover the weird and astonishing medieval worldview, their mind-bending diagrams of the universe, their enchanted landscapes teeming with fairies, goblins, and monsters, and the bizarre creatures and exotic peoples they believed lurked beyond the edges of the map. So come with me as we journey back through the centuries to walk a few miles in the shoes of medieval man and discover how he made sense of existence in a time before mass communication, when the human imagination truly had no limits. To us fearful modern swine, the world seems like an insane, chaotic place, a constant stream of bad news and atrocities beamed directly into the smartphones that are permanently glued to our hands. Even when we think beyond Earth to outer space, we see it as a cold, dark, empty expanse, millions of miles of mostly nothingness that we can hardly understand. But medieval people saw the world around them and the world beyond them a bit differently. They viewed the cosmos as an ordered, awe-inspiring system rather than just a huge, meaningless void. Medieval thinkers imagined the heavens as composed of concentric crystal spheres carrying the stars and planets, all moved by divine love and intelligence. There was no randomness to the medieval universe. Even the unknown wasn't terrifying because all things fell under the dominion of God. In their minds, the good and loving God was ultimately in control of everything, so there was inherent sense to the cosmos even if medieval people weren't able to fully understand it. Though they didn't have modern science to prove their ideas, they did their best to work backwards using reason to deduce what outer space must be like. This process led them to some pretty mind-blowing conclusions. Medieval thinkers imagined a sort of cosmic orchestra filling up the universe beyond Earth that produced the exquisite music of the spheres, a celestial harmony inaudible to human ears but reflecting God's perfect order. The universe, as medieval man understood it, was tingling with anthropomorphic life, dancing, a festival not a machine, as C.S. Lewis famously summarized. They viewed Earth as existing in the middle of some great cosmic party, a constant celebration of divine power where all beings rejoice in the presence of God. To get more specific, if you looked at a medieval map of the cosmos, you'd see Earth motionless at the center, surrounded by the Moon, Mercury, Venus, and so on, all the way up to the primum mobile, the outer sphere whose spin made everything else move. Beyond that was the Empyrean heaven, which was the physical dwelling place of God and all the blessed. The planets also weren't just floating rocks. They had actual spiritual significance. Astrology was a fairly accepted belief system within medieval Catholicism, but that's a topic for another video. Now, the obvious point to raise here is that this belief existed in the Middle Ages because they didn't have access to the same scientific discoveries we do in the 21st century. Medieval man never went to the moon or sent satellites into space to see what was out there. In fact, and I know this is weird to imagine, medieval man wouldn't have even known what Earth looked like from above. That can be a bit jarring to our modern minds because we have such a clear picture when we think of Earth, but that picture simply did not exist hundreds of years ago. It would be wrong to forget all the progress we've made in our understanding of the universe in pursuit of a return to some more imaginative medieval view, but maybe the real takeaway here is that scientific facts don't have to kill our sense of wonder. We can still look up to the sky with awe and humility, and we can always keep in mind that there is plenty about our universe that science has yet to discover. Let's zoom in a little bit from the medieval cosmos to the worldview of the average medieval peasant living a rustic life on a small plot of land in the countryside. These men and women truly believed that the world around them was enchanted, populated by unseen spiritual beings who were both good and mischievous. Forests, rivers, and lonely places were believed to hide fairies, goblins, demons, and other mythical creatures. In medieval literature, we find evidence that these weren't just folk tales, they were widespread beliefs among the common people. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, noted that in the legendary past, all this wide land was land of fairy. The elf queen, her jolly company, danced oftentimes on many a green mead. Of course, there was the obvious problem that most people had never actually seen an elf or fairy, which Chaucer explains away by noting that holy friars had driven them all out of the land. He was writing in the late Middle Ages, which actually gives us some fascinating insight into how the medieval imagination changed over time. Chaucer references this vanished magical age that was already part of medieval nostalgia, which tells us that medieval people took for granted that fairies had once been real in Britain. Other writers treated creatures like fairies and goblins as more of a present reality. Gervase of Tilbury, an English scholar writing in the early 13th century, talks about a type of household spirit known as portunes. According to Gervase, these were a sort of being that lived among rural people in England and France. He describes them as tiny old men in patched coats, harmless and even helpful, sometimes pitching in to carry things into the house or lending a hand to finish up yard work. Exactly what this would have looked like he doesn't say, but if you've ever misplaced something and found it in a more useful spot than you left it, maybe you should thank the portunes. Gervase is sure to mention that they were tricksters too, who loved to play pranks on travelers, mostly by misdirecting them off the road at night so they'd drive their carts into trees or ditches. It sounds like a pretty convenient excuse, honestly. I didn't crash my cart because I got completely hammered at the tavern, I crashed it because an elderly gnome told me to take the wrong turn. Medieval thinkers considered the universe to be completely ordered, so these fantastical creatures were actually a perfect fit to bridge an important gap in their understanding of reality. There were human beings, and there were angels. So by necessity, there must be some middle type of being, which was where fairies and other such things came in. These middle beings, which medieval writers called Longevi, had to exist because they demonstrated that there were no sudden jumps in creation and everything was perfectly graded. The medieval worldview being full of magical creatures also makes a lot of sense considering how much of the natural world would have been a total mystery in a time before popular science. For medieval people, spirits, goblins, and demons were a way to explain the seemingly unknowable forces in daily life, creating this entire unseen dimension that has largely disappeared from our modern mindset. Think about it for a second. If you were a medieval peasant and your friend told you that there was someone on the other side of the country who could levitate, what reason would you have to doubt them? There was no rule or law ingrained in your mind telling you that levitation was impossible. And for that reason, the entire world was full of rich, supernatural possibilities. Now, I'm not necessarily saying we should start arming our home security systems to protect against goblins, but when I see people adamantly claiming that there's no such thing as ghosts or that the soul doesn't exist, it makes me think back to a simpler time when people were willing to lean on their imagination just a little bit more. The world becomes a really boring place when you're only willing to believe in what has been rigorously proven in scientific studies, despite the fact that science has never disproven the existence of ghosts or the reality of the soul, to continue with my example. Science can't prove or measure love either, and yet we would all agree that love exists. But I digress. It's time to talk about the insane creatures medieval people imagined living in faraway lands they would never see. I've had enough of goblins and fairies. I want to talk about dog-headed kings and people with backwards feet. Medieval people knew their immediate world was small, and beyond the familiar lay vast unknown regions. In those far-off lands like the edges of Africa, Asia, or unnamed places that medieval ships had never reached, they imagined that marvelous people and creatures might really exist. Travel literature and encyclopedic writings from the Middle Ages are full of theories about what might lay beyond the horizon, with one of the most popular examples being the 14th century travels of Sir John Mandeville. John describes the bizarre races he supposedly encountered in the Far East, like men with a single eye protruding from their chests and humanoid creatures with no heads and mouths between their two nipples. He doesn't stop there. Other people he mentions include those with huge drooping lips that cover their faces when they sleep, beings as tiny as dwarves with no mouths who communicate by whistling, others with ears hanging to their shoulders, and even wild men with hooved feet as swift as horses. If you or I were to read a travel book that mentioned creatures like these, we'd immediately dismiss it as complete nonsense dreamed up on a bad acid trip. But the medieval reader, who had never traveled far beyond their village, wouldn't be so quick to dismiss these reports. Scholars even included them on world maps and in official texts as plausible inhabitants of distant realms they had never visited. Obviously, travelers like John Mandeville never actually saw any of the freakish people described in these chronicles, so where did they get these ideas? Most were drawn from classical literature, like the one-eyed Cyclops from the Odyssey or the headless Blemmeye from Herodotus's histories. An interesting aspect of medieval academia is that scholars didn't really distinguish between fact and fiction when analyzing and translating ancient texts. For example, they might take an account of an ancient Roman battle and an ancient Greek poem describing fantastical lands full of goat people as equally factual, despite the original author's intent for writing them. Because of this, mythology from antiquity turned into medieval reality, and what ancient people might have considered part of a story became part of history for medieval scholars. These accounts of creatures in far-off places weren't just limited to travel chronicles. The 12th century letter of Prester John, for example, speaks of a far-off Christian king whose lands boasted giants 40 cubits tall, dog-headed men, one-eyed people, pygmies, satyrs, and almost every kind of animal under heaven. Again, these accounts tended to blend travelers' tales, the writings of ancient authors, and a good dose of imagination to create a mysterious world full of God's incredible creation. Prester John was even believed to be a real king. An intensified European interest in the Far East after the First Crusade created fertile ground for this myth to take hold. When medieval rulers started hearing about an Asian leader conquering his heathen enemies with lightning speed, they assumed it was the same Prester John they'd heard so much about. They sent emissaries to meet him and establish diplomatic relations with this good Christian king, only to find out that it was actually Genghis Khan. The medieval imagination was a beautiful tapestry of the wonderful and the insane, but sometimes ignorance is the opposite of bliss. We've now mapped every corner of the earth and no longer have to imagine the people and animals populating the lands we'll never visit. And although our current view of the world is far less creative than the medieval one, maybe that's a good thing. It's much easier to empathize with people in other countries and recognize that they're human beings just like you when you don't have to imagine that they have no heads and big drooling mouths where their stomach should be. We've certainly lost a lot of the magic that came with the medieval worldview, but much of that has been a necessary byproduct of the rapid scientific progress we've achieved in the last few centuries. But I think there's a lot we can learn from the mind of medieval man. He recognized that he didn't know everything, or even most things, and this didn't cause him any fear or anxiety. He respected the order created by God and appreciated the natural beauty and mystery of the world around him. Maybe next time we see a flower we don't recognize or a weird cloud pattern in the sky, we shouldn't immediately rush to Google to figure out the exact answer to every single question we have. Maybe it would be better to sit for a moment, soak in the wonder of our surroundings, and try to let our mind fill the empty space where knowledge would usually be, if only for a few seconds. In the end, the smart man knows that he doesn't know anything at all, and there's a certain humility that comes with that. But what do you think? Did the medieval worldview have its advantages, or is it an outdated relic we should leave in the long-forgotten past? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, and this has been Medieval Mindset. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.